So, one of my favorites essays that I've shared in my newsletter is essentially about classifying games in life. And the thesis is that on some level, essentially, everything in life is a game. That doesn't mean that games are trivial, but what it does mean is that you should look for ways to level up and ways to collaborate, ways to win, and ways to ensure that you can live to play another day. And so the cherry-picked definition of a game that I used is that a game is an activity involving a skill, knowledge, or chance. The idea is that every game you play has a few prerequisites that allow it to be played on common footing with other players. This is everything that you know. Forgive me if you hear lots of scrabbling and noise in the background. It's my dog having a lot of fun with my slipper, so hopefully you can forgive me for that. But essentially, every game you play has a few prerequisites that allow it to be played on common footing with other players. So first, you need to understand how long you're playing for, because the duration might influence whether you want to play at all. Harry, can you stop, please? Stop it. Thank you. Just relax. Do you want some food? Here, have a biscuit. All right, here you go. Good boy. Thanks. Now I can crack on. So, first, you need to understand how long you're playing for. And the duration might influence whether you want to play at all. If I invited you to come and play a football game, and I told you it was going to last 24 hours, you might not fancy it, right? So the paradigm that I'm stealing here is from Simon Sinek, and it's the distinction between finite and infinite games. The second realm of classifying games is deciding on the arena, like where are you going to play? And the type of environment in which the game is played will significantly impact your ability to play. And for the same reason that Rafael Nadal was the master of the clay, while Roger Federer reigned supreme on the grass, you may be more competent and be better suited for some domains than for others. And you won't always get to choose where you play. However, by knowing the field in advance, you can adapt. And so here, I'm stealing another paradigm from David Epstein, which is essentially the kind versus wicked learning environments. Now we've got the duration and we've got the arena. You've got the time and the place. Now come the question of rules. How are you going to play? And Malcolm Gladwell here makes a really great contrast between strong link and weak link sports. And that's going to be useful for this discussion. And then finally, you need to know how you're going to be scored. And so here I'm drawing a line between games that are scored on peak performance and games that are rated based on typical performance. And so we'll go through each of those. So let's start at the top with finite and infinite games. You may probably have heard about Simon Sinek. He has a really popular TED talk. I think it's a TED talk. He has a really popular talk, which is called The Finite and Infinite Games of Leadership. And he presents two sorts of games in game theory. So in finite games, the players are known, the rules are set, and the goal is set. And so this would be like baseball. Meanwhile, in infinite games, the players may be known and unknown, the rules may be changed at any time, and the goal is to perpetuate the game. So you're actually playing to keep playing. And this is like the Cold War. And so, while there's a clearly defined endpoint with winners and losers in a finite game, in an infinite game, the players are striving just to keep the game going. And so there's no winners and losers, there's just survivors and the people that are forced to quit because they get demotivated or run out of resources. When you have both sets of players, there's two different scenarios that you get. The system is stable when you have a finite player versus another finite player. And it's also stable where you have an infinite player versus another infinite player. But where the challenges come is where you have a finite player competing with an infinite player. So one person wants to win, but the other person is playing to keep playing. And so the example that Simon Sinek uses is of the United States and Vietnam, where the Americans were fighting for victory, but the North Vietnamese were battling for survival. And Sinek also draws this analogy to business as well. And essentially his position is that in business, the rules of the game are always in flux. There's no genuine status of winning. The game of business itself has outlasted every firm in the world. So as a business, you're only ever ahead or behind. And I think we've seen great examples of this. I think of sneakers as an example, or trainers, where, you have companies that seem perpetually at the forefront, like Nike and Adidas, although there have been periods of time where they've gone up and down. But then you also have a bunch of other brands like Reebok is a great example, or Puma, or Fila, and Champion, where at some points in time, they were the top brands. Actually, Reebok was the top brand and Champion may have been the top brand. And then they kind of fell behind a bit in terms of the trends and the fashions. And then they had a resurgence when they maybe reclaimed their identity in various ways or reshaped their market positioning. And so the essence is that you're either ahead or behind, but you're never necessarily winning or losing. There's no point at which you win the game of business and the game is over, you just hang up your hat and it's done. There is always an opportunity to keep going. And so because of this distinction, the companies that approach the field knowing that they're playing an infinite game are usually the ones that last the longest. And typically they are the ones that are centered around a fundamentally human mission. And I think Simon Sinek used the example of Apple here. And by contrast, you also see companies that have played finite games by defaulting to competitiveness, and then they lose in the long run. So these are companies maybe like Blockbuster and Kodak and Nokia and Microsoft. So the more you play a finite game within the realm of business, the more likely you are to actually lose. So finite players will always end up in a quandary when coming up against someone that's taking an infinite game approach. It's important to understand where in your life you might benefit from having a finite versus an infinite mindset. There are some situations, certainly, that are winner take all, and you can put everything on the line. There is an end date to the battle that you're fighting, and you know that you can be successful. But at other times, the best thing that you can do is to plan to survive the winter. And the longer you can last, the more successful you eventually become. So that's finite and infinite games. The second paradigm is kind and wicked learning environments. So chess is a complex game. You start with two identical, perfectly mirrored sides. But once each player has made their first move, there are now 400 possible board setups. And then each of them make another move. And now, suddenly, you are in one of 197,742 possible games, after just two moves each. If they make a third move each, so now we have 6 moves total on this board, and now you are playing a 1 in 120 million game. 121 million, actually. And so the players push each other into an increasingly divergent trajectory with each move, and the game grows into a sequence that has likely never been played before. However, as far as learning environments go, chess is incredibly kind. So, in kind learning environments, there are noticeable and repeatable patterns. That's why chess is a good example, and so is golf. These are environments where feedback is exceedingly accurate and generally quite fast. If you're swinging your golf club, you know as soon as you hit it whether you've missed the mark or not. So in games like chess and golf, you can move a piece within very well-established rules and limitations, and you see an immediate result, and you get instant feedback on whether your move has worked or not. And also in these environments, comparable problems occur quite frequently, and you can also train to avoid them. When you drive a golf ball, it slices, it hooks, or it flies straight. With a poor swing, the ball either goes too far or not far enough. The player watches, sees what happens, tries to fix the mistake, and tries again, and so on for years. And this is the notion of deliberate practice, which is linked to both the 10,000 hours rule and the push to early specialization in technical education. Because a student can improve simply by participating in the activity and attempting to do better. And so all of these are considered kind learning environments because there's clear, repeatable patterns, you get really instant feedback, and you can iteratively improve. By contrast, in wicked domains, the rules of the game are frequently vague or incomplete. So recurring patterns may or may not exist, and they may not always be visible. In these kind of environments, feedback is usually delayed, it may be wrong, it could be erroneous, or both. And so in the most devilishly wicked learning environments, experience actually reinforces the exact incorrect lessons. And so you don't get to make binary adjustments. It's not the case that you did it this way and that means you should do it that way. There are a multiplicity of variables and factors. Most of the world is actually more like Martian tennis, which is how Robin Hogarth described it. And essentially, in Martian tennis, the players are on the court with balls and rackets, but the rules haven't been given. It's up to you to figure out how to get them, and they're subject to change at any time. And so there's fields other than chess where focused practice leads to grandmaster-like insight. So surgeons, like golfers and chess masters, also improve by repeating the same process and by recognizing patterns. And accountants and bridge players and poker players all gain correct intuition via practice. However, when the rules are slightly changed, it appears that the specialists have exchanged their flexibility for very restricted expertise. And so in one study, where they were looking at the game of bridge, the experts had a much harder time adjusting to new or slightly different rules when the order of play was changed. So you change one small variable and suddenly someone that is supposed to be an expert is now underperforming compared to complete novices. And similarly, when experienced accountants were asked to apply a new tax legislation to replace a prior one for deductions, they actually performed worse again than complete novices, so people that had zero experience. And so this is maybe the fallacy of expertise in some ways. And this tendency is referred to by Eric Dane as cognitive entrenchment. Eric Dane is a professor at Rice University who researches organizational behavior. So that's the second paradigm. The third category is strong link versus weak link. In most sports, or many modern sports, team building is a game of resource allocation. And so managers are allocated a certain amount of money, maybe to spend on players, or a certain number of player contracts to trade against the team's salary cap. And so as a result, your team formation eventually becomes a trade-off exercise, and every chip that you stake for one player is a chip that you can't use again. And you may find discounted gems under some circumstances, but typically the choices will always filter through a lens of prioritization. And so one dimension of prioritization is quality versus depth. How much of a team's focus should be on superstars versus making sure it has enough depth. Should you emphasize your team's strengths or minimize its flaws? And you see this all the time when teams are trying to rebalance in the NBA. You're trying to figure out, do you resolve your defensive issues? Do you try and get more scorers? There's always this balance and trade-off. And so there's two authors, Chris Anderson and David Sally. They took a deep dive into football analytics, or soccer, whatever you want to call it, in their book called The Numbers Game. And so they characterized a strong link sport as one in which the team with the top player wins most of the time. A weak link sport, on the other hand, is one in which a team with the poorest player could frequently win. And so that may sound counterintuitive, but I'm going to break it down. So essentially, basketball is a great example of a strong link sport. If you hand the ball to LeBron James at any point in the game, there's a good chance he, by himself, will be able to create a scoring opportunity because he has so much influence over the outcome of the game. And his success is a lot less reliant on the team's other links. This is on a score-by-score basis. So in the NBA, you can construct an entire franchise around one great player. And that's what most franchises try to do. They have one or two marquee players. You have super teams where you have 2 or 3 fantastic players and everyone else can be negligible. They can all be pretty rubbish. And so it's easy to see why, by contrast, soccer or football is actually a weak link sport because football is a low scoring game. Every error can be costly. I'm a Liverpool fan. I have haunting nightmares of the season where Liverpool were so close to winning the league and Steven Gerrard literally just slipped and let an attacker, Demba Ba from Chelsea, take the ball and score. You make one mistake in a weak link sport and it can cost you the game. And furthermore, every player has possession for only a portion of the game. As great as Lionel Messi is, when he has the ball, he can accomplish extraordinary teams, but he can't touch the ball until his teammates have completed a series of successful passes. So if the ball starts with the goalkeeper, if the rest of his team can't pass, he doesn't touch the ball. The same with Cristiano Ronaldo, who currently is struggling on Manchester United because people can't find him with long balls and the midfielders are not the best. Well, let me not introduce bias to this, but in football, if you don't have midfielders that can make great passes, your strikers are going to be at a deficiency, even if you have some of the greatest strikers in the world. And so in football, you are only as good as your weakest link. If there is a right back that is just terrible, the other team will take complete advantage of that. They will line up the matchup so that you always get past that guy and you can score. And again, because that does happen in basketball, but football is a low scoring game. So that only needs to happen once to win a game. Whereas in basketball, you're playing almost hundreds of points in some games. And so in football, if your worst player is 40% as good as your greatest player, but makes a terrible pass, it cancels out the 10 prior flawless passes. So the strength of the team as a whole is contingent on the talent of the entire group, no matter how many brilliant places that you have. And that's why in the last few years, actually, Liverpool, that I mentioned, have been able to compete and dominate in Europe and dominate much stronger European teams, stronger on paper, despite having a weaker man-for-man lineup, because they play very well as a team and they didn't have individual weak links. So, in summary, football is a game of mistakes. You can minimize the number of your team's errors by simply replacing your worst player with a better one. And so this weak and strong link dichotomy is incredibly useful in understanding certain types of problems. To use Malcolm Gladwell's example, let's say I handed you $50 billion to spend in a way that improves the efficiency of air travel in the United States. The last thing that you want to do is go to Denver, which already has a large, beautiful new airport, and make it even larger and more beautiful. That's a complete waste of time and money. No, what you should actually do is go to the country's worst and busiest airports, LaGuardia and Newark and Kennedy, and try and improve those, because any delays at Newark and LaGuardia and Kennedy airports reverberate across the entire country, and that causes planes to be delayed everywhere else. So you could blow the entire $50 billion in New York to fix air travel across the entire country. And so you would need to approach this as a weak link problem. But this classification is also very context dependent. In the early days of a startup, for example, the sales function is a strong link sport. You only have a limited amount of chances to secure key clients. All you need is one rockstar salesperson to make each swing a home run. Whereas in a multinational firm, on the other hand, you are upselling and recruiting new clients multiple times a year. So to keep the lights on, you simply need to maintain roughly about the same number of clients each year and show slow but consistent growth. If the rest of your sales staff is bad, paying top dollar for a single superstar has very little influence. So again, you can start to see how the paradigm applies to many facets of life. And I give a lot more examples in a second follow-up newsletter that I did that I will also link in the description. I would definitely read that. And I think in that, I gave a lot more real life examples of how you can start to apply these concepts. So the third paradigm is peak versus typical performance. In organizational psychology, a contrast is drawn between typical and maximal or peak performance as an approach to categorize how you work. Typical performance often refers to how you perform on a regular basis, whereas maximal performance refers to how you perform when you're putting in the utmost effort. It's the difference between what you will do and what you can do. And so when workers are being monitored, they normally perform at their best. And that's why interviews can sometimes be useless. Interviews, management assessments, knowledge exams, all of these are settings that encourage and score based on maximal performance. What is the best you can do? However, there's very little guarantee that the results in those contexts will be reflected in the employee's daily typical performance. So you're only optimizing for those that test well. So if the job that you're testing for is the kind of strong link sport that frequently requires exhibition of peak prowess, that is not a problem. You can hire a magician because they have 3 or 4 tricks that will blow your mind in under 45 minutes. And after that, they can hang up their hat. That's it. Done. But if what you really need is consistent and reliable output, you should look elsewhere. You don't need a data entry guy that can type 300 words per minute for a total of 5 minutes and then needs to rest for an hour. And so a professional runner prepares for a very specific competition and is pushed to perform at their best. Their success is measured in the very same way that a stand-up comedian is. You want their very best at the moment that it matters for a short amount of time. A teacher, on the other hand, is judged by how well they perform on a daily basis. Their stage is the classroom. Their success is determined by how engaged pupils are and how much they've learned over the course of an entire year. And so, those are the 4 realms by which I'd classify games in life. I hope that wasn't too long or too boring. I will do a follow-up to this. I've already written a follow-up newsletter, but I may do a follow-up video which will explain more contextually how some of these apply. But I think based on those paradigms, you could probably already start to see how you can think of classifying areas in your life that might be better for peak versus optimal performance, areas in your life where you should see it as a finite versus an infinite game, areas that are kind versus wicked learning environments, and areas that are strong link versus weak link. And so I think the more that you take some of these factors into account, the better you can adapt your approach to playing the various games in life.